For at least the past 20 to 30 years, Bloom's taxonomy has been used to help us create what we call mastery objectives. And before we actually get into what a mastery objective is, it's really important to understand Bloom's taxonomy, what it was intended to do, and then how educators have reappropriated it to help us measure and guide our lesson planning and our teaching. So to begin with, what is a taxonomy? Well, a taxonomy is a hierarchical categorization of just about anything that's based on shared characteristics. So we could create a taxonomy. In science, we obviously do this with organisms and species, and that's where we've gotten this term. But Bloom, in the mid-50s, 1950s, actually used this idea of taxonomy to categorize ways in which we think. And he actually came up with these 6 categories right here, and a triangle's been used for quite a while to kind of illustrate this hierarchical process. So knowledge becomes more sophisticated the further we go up this taxonomy. So what do these terms mean? Knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. Well, when we talk about knowledge, we're really talking about recall. Those basic facts, the most basic pieces of any disciplinary knowledge. For comprehension, one step up is where we start getting to this idea, and admittedly this is an amorphous idea, of understanding. A little bit deeper, using these recalled facts to make sense of the world. So this is one level up. Once we have this basic understanding, we can start applying it to different situations. So application is use in different situations. Analysis is fairly simple. It's breaking things down. When we talk about breaking things down, this is where we're really talking about critical thinking. This idea that to think critically is to be able to look at a picture and figure out its component parts and how something works. And that differs from synthesis, which is actually the opposite of putting things together. This has been referred to as creative thinking. And finally, with evaluation, we're talking about judgment. So these are the levels that Bloom categorized our human thinking within. It's a particularly cognitive model, not really thinking too much about behaviors, but it's really interesting that how it's been appropriated. So educators were able to look at this and say, well, if we know that these are the 6 ways in which we think, the 6 categories of cognition, then we have to be able to measure this thinking in some way. So what they did was they started creating this idea of mastery objectives. We know that a student and this is in big quotation marks here, that a student is progressing in their knowledge if we can measure where they are on this taxonomy, where their thinking is in this taxonomy. And in fact, we can even push our instruction so that we're really hitting 1 or 2 of these levels to really make sure that students know, quote unquote, what's going on. To do this, we've come up with some verbs that kind of link to these these levels of cognition. So when we talk about knowledge, some verbs that we might use would be, let's say, define. If I can define a word, I might know that word and be able to recall it. I might label, or I might list. For comprehension, words that might be used might be to defend, to explain. This is actually one of my favorite words. When I think of comprehension, I really think if they can explain it, in a reasonable way, then they comprehend the topic. Another great verb here, and this is a compound verb, is to provide examples. If a student can provide examples of a concept, I'm fairly sure that they've comprehended it. For application, we might use verbs such as, obviously, apply. Makes sense. Demonstrate. Or even better, manipulate. If I can manipulate a situation given something that I learned in class, I really know that I can apply it to different situations. For analysis, I might use a verb like diagram, kind of like those diagramming sentences that we used to do in grade school. I might use compare or contrast, or I might use something like deconstruct, which is a very vivid word to link to analysis. If I can deconstruct an argument, if I can deconstruct a situation, a scientific situation, then I know that I can analyze it. For synthesis, again, like I said, these are almost exact opposites, but it's bringing that level of cognition up just a bit to that creative side. So I might use a verb like create, modify, or reconstruct. If you think about some of the more heady TV shows like the CSIs, the best detectives always reconstruct a scene. And that's some really heavy cognitive work. And finally, we have evaluate. So we might use verbs like critique, justify, or maybe interpret. These verbs then become the basis for what we're going to talk about when we talk about mastery objectives. Mastery objectives. Okay. Before we get into how to create mastery objectives, though, there are a couple basic rules for how we write them so that it's a little bit more standardized across our discipline or our field. First of all, a mastery objective must be focused on a behavior. So let me give you an example and a non-example to prove that I can comprehend this. So an example, a yes example, would be something like recall. If I can recall something, obviously that's related to knowledge. A non-example would be something like understand. Every single one of us understands the world a little bit differently, and our levels of understanding per concept differ. In fact, this whole Bloom's taxonomy illustrates that concept. I can understand certain things through recall, but that doesn't mean that I understand them at the same level as being able to judge it or to critically think about it, to analyze it, or even to apply it to a different situation. So these amorphous words that talk about more epistemological issues, not so much mastery of a concept or mastery of some topics, shouldn't be used. So it must be a behavior. The other other area that we really need to consider is that it explains learning by the end of class. So I've seen a lot of teachers and student teachers create mastery objectives, or what they called mastery objectives, for a 2 to 3 week lesson. Well, what we're really trying to do here with these mastery objectives is identify learning per lesson. So as a teacher, I know when my students walk out if I know that they were able to define something or demonstrate something or create something, I know what level, where they are in this taxonomy so that I know how to proceed in the next thing, in the next lesson, not something that we're going to measure over time. We might measure these over, something like this over time, but that's not actually called a mastery objective then. That would be an outcome. The third component to mastery objectives that we really need to remember when we're writing them is that the focus is on learning, not coverage. As a former history teacher, I can really attest to this idea that a lot of times you're given a curriculum and you're told you need to get from, let's say, the beginning of the United States all the way through Reconstruction. That's a coverage issue. What these mastery objectives, the purpose of this is to focus our lessons on what are students learning within this coverage, within the content that we are talking about. What are they learning? Because it's this learning, when we talk about 21st century skills, that's important so that we can actually start applying, comparing, reconstructing, and critiquing. These are the skills that we're going to be touching upon, or our students are going to be touching upon when they go out into the workplace, not whether they can identify who the third president of the United States was. That's not so important. That's a coverage component. What we're really looking for is this higher order thinking and this learning piece. So, how do we write mastery objectives? We always begin writing mastery objectives with the phrase, students will be able to. And you might see this abbreviated as SWBAT. I did that a lot because, quite frankly, I got a little bit lazy and didn't want to write this out all the time. So students will be able to, and you're going to look for 3 good mastery objectives for every lesson. So the way we write this is we begin with the verb, and then we write our mastery objectives. So let me give you an example. Maybe one of the mastery objectives I have is label. Let's see, what can we label? All 50 states by name, or their capitals or something like that. So notice that I started with the verb label. Students will be able to label all 50 states. This is something that I can measure. I can look at a student's work and see really clearly how many states they could label. Maybe my mastery objective isn't to label all 50 states. Maybe it's to label 25. Or shoot, maybe it's to label 5 states south of the Mason-Dixon line, because we're focusing on southern states for some reason within the curriculum. Whatever that mastery objective is, how I would define successful learning in a class, by the end of that class, that's what I want my mastery objective to be. Another example might be to diagram something. So maybe we're going to diagram, let's think about English for a second. The speeches in Hamlet, per characters power. So maybe, and I have no idea if this is true and I'm totally making it up, but maybe I want students to be able to diagram these speeches and really analyze if a person has power, that they use speech in one way. If a person doesn't have so much power and they're giving a speech, they use their language in a different way. But to critically think, to diagram this analysis. Or I could go all the way up to say something like critique social Darwinism, via Darwin's theory.